Hello and welcome to the Matthew Rocky Show for this week of May 30th. Thanks so much for taking the time to tune in for the podcast this week. We've got just a handful of news stories to cover here in this first half, beginning with this one from the education world. Since the onset of COVID-19, parents have taken the reins of their children's education and made homeschooling mainstream. Before the pandemic, homeschooling rates from the U.S. Census Bureau have been holding steady at around 3% since 2012. However, data from 18 states revealed the number of home-educated students skyrocketed 63% in the 2020-2021 academic cycle and fell by only 17% during the 2021-2022 school year. The total number of children receiving home education soared to 3.7 million in that time frame. A drop in public school enrollment rates this year reflected that trend. In 2020 to 2021, the number of students enrolled in public school fell by 3%, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, yet the rates haven't rebounded as expected this year, despite a return to physical classes and more flexible COVID-19 protocols in some districts. Conversely, enrollment numbers dropped another 0.2% nationwide, varying by state and school district. Conversely, enrollment numbers dropped another 0.2% nationwide, varying by state and school district. The House Judiciary Committee on June 2nd voted to advance a gun control bill in the wake of a deadly shooting in Uvalde, Texas. The final vote fell along party lines, with every committee Republican voting against the legislation and every committee Democrat voting to advance it. Splits between Democrats and Republicans were on full display during the hearing, which focused on the Protecting Our Kids Act, which is H.R. 7910. That bill, among other provisions, would ban the sale of any semi-automatic centerfire rifle or semi-automatic centerfire shotgun that has the capacity to accept an ammunition feeding device with a capacity exceeding 5 rounds to citizens below the age of 21. Currently, one only needs to be 18 to buy such a weapon. It would also codify the Department of Justice's controversial ban on bump stocks, a weapon modification that increases the fire rate of a semi-automatic firearm. In addition, it would also make it a federal crime to possess weapons that critics have labeled ghost guns, usually describing homemade or 3D printed weapons without a serial number. Democrats pushed strongly for the passage of the bill, saying that stricter gun laws were needed in response to the shooting in Uvalde that left 19 children and 2 adults dead. The legislation, quote, might have saved those children in Uvalde, unquote, Judiciary Chairman Jerry Nadler from New York said, adding, quote, whoever saves one life, it's as if he saved the whole world, unquote. Others pushed for the bill as a matter of urgency and called for various changes to Senate rules and the Supreme Court's composition if necessary to pass the legislation. The Chinese Communist Party continues to be a glaring example of a regime that represses its citizens from exercising religious liberty, according to Rashad Hussain, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. On remarks on June 2nd, unveiling a 2,000-page State Department report on world religious freedom, he said, quote, far too many governments remain undeterred of their repression of their citizens. It comes as no surprise that the People's Republic of China is a glaring example here. 140 pages of the report were dedicated to China. The annual report painted a bleak picture for China's religious believers who live under constant threat of punishment for exercising their rights, with religious venues shut down and adherents jailed for distributing materials about their beliefs. Other faith groups are not spared from the heavy-handed suppression either. The communist regime recognizes 5 religions, Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Protestantism, and Catholicism, dubbing them, quote, patriotic religious associations, unquote, and forces religious groups to register with their associations in order to hold worship services. A new regulation, effective last May, requires all religious clergy to swear allegiance to the CCP and socialism and create a database of religious personnel. United States labor productivity tumbled in the first quarter to its slowest rate since 1947, while unit labor costs soared, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics report released June 2nd. A surge in unit labor costs and hourly compensation in the first quarter of 2022 was reflected in a steep drop in productivity. Wages continued to make gains, a factor in causing inflation rates to further accelerate. A nationwide worker shortage contributed to the boost in wage growth, with a reported 11.4 million job openings at the end of April. Massive disruptions in the composition of the workforce post-pandemic have made it harder for the government analysis to measure underlying productivity and labor growth, and have made the Federal Reserve's current fight against inflation more difficult. Non-farm productivity, which is a measurement of hourly output per worker, fell at a 7.3% annualized rate in the first quarter, an upward revision to the 7.5% decline that was estimated last month. This was the steep downturn in productivity from the 6.3% growth rate in the fourth quarter of last year. Non-farm rates declined 0.6% from a year ago. The decline reflected a 4.2% increase in output, outpaced by a 4.8% increase in hours worked. Amber Heard's lawyer revealed on Thursday that her client can't afford to pay the millions of dollars in damages after losing a defamation case against her ex-husband and Golden Globe-winning actor Johnny Depp, saying she will absolutely appeal the case. A 7-person jury in Virginia reached a verdict on Wednesday regarding Depp's defamation lawsuit against his ex-wife Heard. Jurors concluded that the 36-year-old Aquaman actress defamed her ex-husband when she wrote a 2018 opinion article for the Washington Post. In favor of Depp, the jury awarded compensatory damages of $10 million and punitive damages of $5 million, which was reduced by Judge Penny Escarte to Virginia's $350,000 statutory cap. They also ruled that Depp has to pay $2 million to Heard. It ruled in favor of a counterclaim Heard had filed after Depp's lawyer called her abuse allegations a hoax. During an interview on NBC's daily live broadcast, The Today Show, Heard's lawyer, Elaine Bredehoft, said her client is absolutely not able to pay the $10.4 million in damages the jury awarded to the 58-year-old actor. Tens of thousands of egg-laying chickens are estimated to have been killed in a barn fire on May 28th at one of Minnesota's largest egg producers. Wright County fire officials reportedly are still trying to determine the cause of the blaze at Forsman Farms that destroyed the building. Company spokesman John Austin said, quote, "We're surveying the damage to see if there's anything beyond the building. It's a substantial facility with hundreds of thousands of chickens on site," unquote. Forsman Farms plans to continue operating in other buildings on site and 5 other locations throughout the upper Midwest to maintain egg production levels and supply. Established in 1918, the Howard Lake facility is the company's oldest, producing more than 3 million eggs per day. The company operates with 30 to 40 employees, and none will be laid off because of the fire. A group of 12 House Republicans introduced a proposal in Congress this week that would make knowingly sharing confidential information from the Supreme Court a crime punishable by a fine or as many as 5 years in prison. The legislation comes a month after a leaked draft majority opinion indicated the Supreme Court was preparing to overturn Roe v. Wade, the seminal 1973 precedent that federalized abortion policy, overriding the states and making the procedure lawful throughout the entire United States. The landmark 7-2 decision held that a woman's right to an abortion was safeguarded by her right to privacy under the 14th Amendment. Politico published the draft decision written by Justice Samuel Alito in Dobbs v. Jackson's Women's Health Organization on May 2nd. The proposed Leaker Accountability Act is a 3-page measure whose principal sponsor is House Republican Conference Vice Chair Mike Johnson from Louisiana. The bill was introduced on May 31st. Johnson said in a statement, quote, "The unauthorized leak of the draft opinion in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health constitute a grave breach of judicial ethics and a deliberate attack on the independence of the Supreme Court. This legislation is now, unfortunately, a necessary step to discourage future such attempts to intimidate justices during their deliberative process and restore independence to the court so that it can ensure the American people are afforded equal and impartial justice under the law. The institution of the court has been damaged, and we must do what we can to repair it." Unquote. The election integrity group True the Vote presented Arizona lawmakers with cell phone tracking data showing alleged ballot traffickers visited drop boxes in two of the state's largest counties, no less than 5,700 times during the 2020 election. The founder of the group, Catherine Engelbrecht, said, quote, "When we started the project, we didn't know what we would find," unquote. The group investigators settled on 10 visits as an actual number, but here in Arizona, they went an average of 21 times, Engelbrecht told the panel on May 31st. Lawmakers vowed to move forward with HB 2289 to make ballot drop boxes illegal in Arizona. During the 90-minute presentation, Engelbrecht and True the Vote data investigator Greg Phillips, former head of Mississippi's Department of Human Services, described the group's investigation into so-called mules, or illegal ballot runnels, and the role NGOs may have played to commit 2020 election fraud. The investigation focused on two of the state's largest counties, Maricopa County and Yuma County, and on unique visits to ballot boxes, utilizing cell phone tracking technology to develop patterns of life for each alleged ballot trafficker. The Supreme Court voted 5-4 late on May 31st to temporarily block a Texas law that prevents social media platforms from censoring users based on their political views. Known as HB 20, the state law makes it unlawful for tech platforms to restrict or remove content based on, quote, "the viewpoint of the user or another person," or, quote, "the viewpoint represented in the user's expression," unquote. The statute also requires the platforms to establish procedures users can use to appeal a platform's decision to, quote, "remove content posted by the user," unquote. The law applies to platforms that have more than 50 million active monthly users in the United States. Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed the bill in September of 2021. A study on the National Poison Data System has found that suspected suicide attempts via self-poisoning in children have increased by 26.7% from 2015 to 2020, with researchers highlighting the nation's increasing mental health crisis among adolescents. Dr. Christopher Holstage, director of the Division of Medical Toxicology at the University of Virginia, said, quote, "Our study is one of a number that demonstrates that we are experiencing an unprecedented mental health crisis in younger age groups," unquote. The authors from UVA also cautioned that their data is an underrepresentation of the actual number of suspected suicides by self-poisoning, as NPDS, of which the study is based on, relies on voluntary reports alone. Suspected suicides under NPDS encompasses suicide deaths as well as intentional and suspected suicide attempts. The study found that the total number of self-poisoning cases increased from 75,248 in 2015 to 93,534 in 2020, with girls accounting for 77.9% of pediatric self-reports. Welcome back into the Matthew Rocky Show for this week of May 30th. Let's take a look back at this week in history. Well, on Monday, it was Memorial Day, and one note right off the bat I want to mention that's very ceremoniously tied in with Memorial Day. It was in 1958, unidentified American service members killed in World War II and the Korean War were interred in the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington National Cemetery. 1958, that day back on May 30th. Some other notes from May 30th. First of all, back in 1431, Joan of Arc, condemned as a heretic, was burned at the stake in France. 1922, the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in ceremony, attended by President Warren G. Harding, Chief Justice William Howard Taft, and Robert Todd Lincoln. 1935, Babe Ruth played his final Major League Baseball game for the Boston Braves, leaving after the first inning of the first of a doubleheader against the Philadelphia Phillies, who won both games. Ruth would announce his retirement 3 days later. And one final note. In 1989, student protesters in Beijing erected a Goddess of Democracy statue in Tiananmen Square. The statue was destroyed in the Chinese government's crackdown. On to the 31st of May, 1790. President George Washington signed into law the first U.S. Copyright Act. 1859, the Big Ben clock tower in London went into operation, chiming for the first time. 1889, some 2,200 people in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, perished when the South Fork Dam collapsed, sending 20 million tons of water rushing through the town. For Wednesday, June 1st, a few notes. First of all, it was in 1792 that Kentucky became the 15th state, and then just 4 years later, in 1796, Tennessee became the 16th state in the Union. In 1980, CNN, known as Cable News Network, made its debut. Once again, 1980, the date for that. And then jumping to Thursday, a few notes. First of all, it was in 1924, Congress passed and President Calvin Coolidge signed a measure guaranteeing full American citizenship for all Native Americans born within U.S. territorial limits. 1941, baseball's iron horse, Lou Gehrig, died in New York at the age of 37 from what is known as ALS, or Lou Gehrig's disease. In 1979, Pope John Paul II arrived in native Poland on the first visit by a pope to a communist country. And then jumping to today, Friday, it is June the 3rd, a few notes to mention. First of all, in 1621, the Dutch West India Company received its charter for a trade monopoly in parts of the Americas and Africa. Also from that day, it was in 1935 that French liner Normandy set a record on its maiden voyage, arriving in New York after crossing the Atlantic in just 4 days. And then finally, for the third, one note other to mention, it was in 2016 that heavyweight boxing champion Muhammad Ali died at a hospital in Scottsdale, Arizona at the age of 74. Well, let's look at some of those unusual stories from around the U.S. over the last week, beginning with this one. Let her eat cake. Well, a man seemingly disguised as an old woman in a wheelchair chucked a chunk of cake at the Mona Lisa at a museum in Paris this last week. The 36-year-old man was transferred into a police psychiatric unit pending an investigation into possible charges of damage to the cultural artifact. Videos posted on social media shows the young man in a wig and lipstick arriving in a wheelchair. The cake flinging left a white, creamy smear on the glass, but guards wiped the frosting off, and the famous work by Leonardo da Vinci was not damaged. Jumping to California, since missing out on getting his high school diploma in 1962, Ted Sams has regretted it. Well, he has regrets no more. At the age of 78, Sims is finally a high school graduate after getting his diploma on Friday. In 1962, Sims was a senior at San Gabriel High School in Southern California, but got suspended just before the year ended. He missed the final exam and had to repeat the class over the summer. When Sims went to get his diploma, he was denied because he owed $4.80 for a book. He complained about all this over the decades, but decided to get his diploma. The school still had it, and Sims got it when he did the walk at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena with all the other high school graduates this week. Well, I guess better late than never. But I'm curious if he was just not willing to pay the $4.80. It doesn't really say. I'm guessing that's where the reason why he didn't get it before. Or maybe it was just one of those things where, it wasn't really that big of a deal to him and he was able to do what he was going to do in life without it. But either way, I don't know. I would have done it a whole lot sooner if I were in his shoes. The fries were up, but no one at a Sonic fast food restaurant in Brunswick, Georgia was up to the task of pulling them from the hot oil. Well, that's because of what was behind the fryer: a snake. The workers fled after the reptile was found and didn't return until it was gone. Workers described the snake as brown with diamonds on its back. However, Police Lieutenant Matthew Wilson identified it as a large ball python, a non venomous critter. He tells the Brunswick News he removed it and found a home with a friend who is fond of snakes. Well, there you go. A snake and a Sonic. There's been some unusual stories about fast food restaurants and different critters that have found a way into the back. It doesn't say what the effects were of this one being found at the Sonic. I'm not sure if they had to close or anything like that, but I remember a few years ago there is a Whataburger restaurant down in Texas, I believe it was Whataburger, who found a rat in their fryer. Of course, dead and obviously very disgusting, but yeah, they were a little bit perplexed as to how that happened, and they closed the restaurant for like 3 days and did a massive cleaning to make sure there is no other rats in the building. Moving right along with a couple of other final stories for this week. This one out in Boston. It took more than 3 centuries, but the scales of justice have finally tipped in the right direction. Now that a woman convicted and put to death for having been a witch has finally gotten her name cleared. Lawmakers in Massachusetts have formally exonerated Elizabeth Johnson Jr. 329 years after she was convicted of being a witch and sentenced to death during the Salem witch trials. Johnson was actually never executed, nor was she ever pardoned, though, which was something that happened to those others wrongfully accused of witchcraft in those trials. Well, imagine going one-on-one with a mountain lion inside an empty building. Well, a custodian in Northern California at a high school there didn't have to imagine it because it actually happened to him. Officials with the San Mateo County Sheriff's Office says the custodian was able to spirit the mountain lion into an empty classroom where it was kept confined. There were no students or staff inside the Piscatero High School when the big cat strolled into campus. The animal, described as lost and scared, was removed by federal wildlife officials who returned it to its natural habitat. There you go. We're going to need a much bigger pot. Scientists say they have discovered what is the world's largest plant. It's a seagrass meadow that extends underwater. A genetic analysis of the plant indicates the seagrass bed is a single organism that has grown by cloning itself repeatedly over the last hundreds of years. The plant covers an area larger than Washington, D.C., but in this case, bigger isn't always stronger. Though the seagrass meadow is huge, it's vulnerable to climate change and cyclones. In fact, it's lost about a tenth of its size because of rising temperatures and storms. Info on all of it is being published in a journal, Proceedings of the Royal Society B. There you go. I can't imagine a plant that big, and it makes sense that it's underwater. I feel like if it was above water, it would have been disturbed long before. But either way, something that covers an area larger than DC, absolutely incredible. Well, that'll do it for the Matthew Rocky Show for this week. A couple of final notes for you. Well, my parents told me that they didn't have a favorite child, but it was tough considering I was the only child. Well, somebody actually complimented me on my driving today. I was left with a little note on my windshield the other day that said parking fine. I was like, well, that's nice. It's kind of bad grammar, but I appreciate it. Another thing, my roommate was mad. I woke him up at 3 a.m., but I just wanted to remind him that he had forgotten to take his sleeping pills. I thought I was doing him a favor, but apparently not. And my friend said he bet that I couldn't beat him in a race. It was a bit difficult to do while running, but I landed him in the hospital, all right. Well, I had to fire my fruit delivery driver today. He was driving me bananas, so I just had to let that man go. All right, hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. We'll see you next time right here on the Matthew Rocky Show.